First of all, I'd like to thank the Business Committee for agreeing to my request to have a debate on this very important report, Monitoring Adequate Housing in Ireland by the Irish Human Rights Equality Commission and the Economic and Social Research Institute. And the reason why I wanted us to have a debate is because I actually think the contents of the report, but also I think what the report's authors and sponsors are trying to do is really, really important. I do want to express some surprise and maybe a little disappointment, Minister, that of your 15 minutes you spent 3 minutes talking about the report and the remainder about all of the good things that the government is promising to do. And while, of course, the government is going to use its time to promote the work it's doing, I would have thought some more considered commentary on the report itself, and particularly some of the things that I think the report is urging all of us to do, would have been valuable, and I'll stress by what I mean by that in just a moment. What's really important about this report is it is not just another description of the very, very difficult circumstances that tens of thousands of people find themselves in across the state. We have a lot of those reports produced by many good organisations. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has a very specific statutory function, which isn't just to document a case of inequality, but to assist the state in trying to fully understand the causes of that inequality, to be able to monitor it, measure it, so that as the government, for example, rolls out the measures that the Minister just outlined, we'll actually have some evidence base to see, well, does that actually make any difference or not? So, for example, I think one of the things government absolutely needs to consider is it actually going to embrace the kind of methodology that underlines the analysis in this report, which I'll summarise shortly, and more importantly, the commitment to assessing your own actions, the outcomes against what is being proposed in this report over the weeks, months and years ahead. Because I think what the Equality and Human Rights Commission are trying to do in particular is to say it is time we had a robust methodology for understanding and measuring housing adequacy. And in fact, the methodology that they set out is really quite innovative, and I think it captures a broad range of circumstances which gives us a much more profound insight into housing inadequacy and particularly how it affects very specific groups of people. The Minister ran through quite quickly the 6 dimensions or the 6 criteria in the report, but they're really important to understand fully. Obviously, access to housing is key, and that rests on the supply, particularly on the supply of affordable purchase homes, of social rental and of affordable rental homes in the private rental sector. And while the report acknowledges that there has been some progress in that date, it also mentions that that progress is from a very, very low base, and therefore access is still a fundamental problem. For affordability, they outlined 3 indicators, and I think this is interesting because affordability is one of the most used and most misunderstood words in our housing debate. And they talk about what they call the 30-40 rule, looking at households in the bottom 4 income deciles who are spending more than 30% of their net income on mortgages or rents. They look at the prevalence of what they call post-housing poverty rates. Because people are paying very high housing costs, that makes them even more likely to be experiencing poverty in other aspects of their lives. And they also look at prevalence of rent and mortgage arrears. And, you know, for me, the first of those is one, for example, that the ESRI and others have used before, but having that broader definition of affordability, I think, is really crucial. Because it means when any of us are talking about increasing supply of private or public homes, we have to ensure that that supply is done in a way that meets those kinds of indicators, a really fundamental shift. They talk about security, and that is both the length of tenure in a given form of accommodation and the security in that tenure. And I will come back at the end to some of the Minister's comments around recent Cabinet decisions. And also the cultural adequacy issue, and this isn't just about ensuring, for example, that travellers have access to culturally appropriate accommodation where those families and individuals choose that, but it is also about whatever kind of interim accommodation we provide for people seeking asylum in this country, that too is culturally appropriate. And again, I'll respond to the Minister's comments on the government's action to date on that. Housing quality itself is really important, and again, so much of our focus right across the chamber has been on increasing output, that we have not paid enough attention to whether or not the quality of the accommodation that's already within our stock it meets people's needs, and how to ensure that as new stock comes online, it's improved. And the Irish Government is still in breach of Article 16 of the European Convention of Human Rights, following the collective complaint taken by the residents of a large number of social housing projects across the state some years ago. And while the Minister O'Brien has given us a detailed response to that, the most recent communication from the relevant committee in Strasbourg is that the Government is still in breach of that article, notwithstanding the improvements that the Government claimed to have made. So if we can't even ensure the accommodation for existing social housing tenants is adequate under international legal obligations, what hope have we of improving accommodation into the future? And then location is also absolutely key. This is the sixth indicator, both in terms of proximity to services and access to other amenities. The Minister did absolutely talk through some of the findings, and I'm not going to repeat those here, other than they confirm what many of us know for a long time. There are specific groups of people who are structurally disadvantaged in our housing system and continue to be so, despite 5 years of rebuilding Ireland and housing policies before that. And there are many of us who will be keeping a very open mind, but will be quite sceptical as to whether at the end of the current government's housing plan, if we get to its end, those groups will be any less structurally disadvantaged. I hope they are, but the jury will definitely be out of that for quite some time. In addition to trying to provide a methodology, which I think the Human Rights and Equality Commission are urging all of us to embrace as a tool for assessing independently the progress of what government is doing, they also set out a number of challenges, some of those related to COVID and the potential for homelessness to start rising again, as we've seen in the last 4 months of departmental reports, as we ease our way out of COVID and protections for renters have been lifted. Obviously, there's the continual rise of rents, and we will have a more detailed debate about the Minister's latest attempt to clean up the mess of his last attempt to clean up the mess of his previous 3 or 4 attempts to clean up Eoin Murphy's mess when we debate the legislation in a couple of weeks' time. But also data is absolutely crucial, and the Minister is right. We are finally going to get a traveller identifier in the housing needs assessment. It took the department 3 years from when that recommendation was made by the expert group on travel accommodation to when it's going to happen. We're not going to get it until next year's housing needs assessment. We won't get the data until the following year, so it will be 4 years. So it's taking us 4 years to make one very, very important but very, very small change in the overall quality of the data sets that we have. And I have to say, I think the government needs to take the issue of how we best produce the data, and I'm not convinced, and this is no disrespect to any official in the Department of Housing, because they're very busy doing other things, I'm not convinced they have the time or expertise to be primarily responsible for the collation and publication of data, and I think that would be much better dealt with by the CSO and Housing Agency on a whole range of fronts. In the very small amount of time I have left, I want to say this. I think the Minister is codding himself if he thinks the list of actions that he read out is going to tackle the very fundamental structural problems underlying the kinds of housing disadvantage that this report exposes. Because the policies that he's outlined and the policy document it's based on is broadly within the policy consensus that has dominated housing policy for successive governments here since the 1990s. And those structural problems have been with us through all of that. And what I would urge the Minister to do, because I know Minister Noonan is a very decent man, and I know he genuinely cares about the structural inequalities that we're discussing, notwithstanding the content of some of the speech that, unfortunately, he's obliged to read out as a consequence of being a junior Minister of State. But please, as future monitoring reports from organisations such as the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission are published, don't ignore them. Don't dismiss them and rely solely on the statistics and public lines that are provided to you by your policy advisors or civil servants. If the trends continue in the direction they have been going in recent years, or if they deteriorate, then stop and absorb the information that this independent body, established under statute by previous governments, the information they're providing to say things aren't working and things need to be done differently. It's very, very easy for government to dismiss the opposition, to accuse us of playing politics and not wanting to help. And while I reject those claims when they're made, it is easy for government to do that. It is much more difficult for government to ignore the independent, rigorous and evidence-based research that's produced by organisations such as these. And all I would ask you to do is, despite the fact that I think you've spent most of your time ignoring this report in your speech today, don't ignore it when you go back to the Customs House. Embrace it and use it as a tool to improve housing policy into the future.
Thank you, Deputy.